Welcome to Dynasty Builders, your go-to destination for fantasy basketball insights. Whether you're a seasoned veteran or just getting started, we've got something for you. Join us for engaging basketball banter, cutting-edge analysis, and next-level scouting that will give you the edge over your competition. Our takes are not just hot, they're backed by thought and evidence, offering valuable insights into both familiar and under-the-radar players. I'm Paul, the brains behind HoopDex, a visual fantasy basketball index that helps you assess players' strengths and weaknesses like never before. And with me is Zach, the mastermind behind Dizzle Dynasty Sports and our go-to guru for all things draft related. Together, we're here to take your fantasy game to new heights. Let's get started.
All right, so first guy we're going to talk about today for our contending assets to consider that may or may not be related to our deadline. One of the names that I threw out to you is Duop Reath, currently the backup big for the Portland Trailblazers. He's been pretty good this year. He's been someone who has bounced around basketball for a long time. He played for a variety of international teams and finally made his way to the NBA. And he's been pretty darn good. He's been, for terms of his stats, we're looking at 9.1 points per game, 3.9 rebounds, 1.2 assists, 0.5 steals, 0.5 blocks, 47.9% from the field, 38.3 from three, and 76% from the free throw line, and then 60% true shooting. So he's been interesting. Me personally, the reason that I have him in more of a contending asset who might be cheap is I don't really buy the long term upside. He's already 27 and he's going to be 28 this June. He's pretty slow. He's not really going to be like our dynamic rim protecting magnet who's going to be like deterring anybody. He's not really just like an up down guy for the most part. As evidenced by the blocks, the 0.5 blocks, he's not going to be a shot blocker at any point. But what I like about him is he's a good complement to DeAndre Ayton in Chauncey Billups' team identity. He shoots pretty well, and he's a really good floor stretcher that I think fits pretty well for what this team is trying to do. And I think even if we consider the fact that he's probably limited to being a role player for his career, he's pretty serviceable, and I think if he continues along at this job, he's going to do pretty well. Currently, in terms of Portland's situation, Ayton, it's kind of questionable at this point whether DeAndre Ayton should be a cornerstone of this team or not. But we also have some questions about Jeremy Grant, who's starting at the four, what the situation is with Robert Williams' health. Whatever their 2024 pick situation is in a big, heavy draft, there's a good chance if they end up with a pretty good pick, they could end up with Alex Sarr or maybe Donovan Clingan, somebody who's a bit more of a rim protector. A lot of questions, basically. So I'll ask you too. What do you think about Duop Reath as a contending asset going forward?
Duop. Well, he's definitely someone that has stepped into the absolute carcass of a roster Portland has left at this point. He's definitely been serviceable. If you're in, like, I want to say a 16, 18 plus team league, he's someone that can give you, like you said, that immediate production. It's going to be low end, but he doesn't really hurt you anywhere. His stats aren't very sexy, but the most interesting thing is definitely his floor spacing ability. Like you said, right now, 38% from three. And that shooting ability kind of opens the possibility of him at times sharing the floor with Ayton a little bit. And in the future, if they do draft another elite big, alongside them. So there's a little bit of versatility. The thing is, he's definitely pretty slow footed and probably isn't a long term. He doesn't have NBA starting upside. I'll say that. But for the cost at the moment, if you're in a deep league and you're looking for some deep big man stats a little bit, yeah, it's definitely someone to consider. Let me ask you that. In a out of Portland's like front court, how would you rank Toumani, Camara, Jabari Walker, and Duop by upside? For me, I'll go first. I think Toumani's upside is the greatest because of his versatility and his athleticism. I'll put Jabari Walker second. I do think Jabari is a more NBA ready player than Toumani right now, like this moment, but I think he doesn't have the foot speed and the lateral quickness that Toumani has to really reach the high end like defensive potential that Camara has. So I'll put him in the middle and do up last. What about you?
Mm. In terms of upside order, Toumani is definitely the guy that I think has the highest upside. I absolutely love Toumani Camara. I probably should have been higher on him in retrospect, especially once he got traded to Portland. He's just a really good player. Everything that you see him do, he soaks up really good minutes. He's been a good defender. He's been someone who can just kind of do a lot of different things out on the court. He fits really well with the entire team. I mean, he's been soaking up like consistent 30 plus minute nights pretty much since the beginning, and it seems like he really earned Chauncey Billups' trust, which I like. Um, I think he's going to be a role player in the league for a really long time, and I don't know exactly like how high his potential ends up going as more than that. Maybe he ends up being just a consistent starter, but I really like his upside a lot. Close behind is Jabari Walker for me. I really like Jabari Walker, and I thought he was really good out of Colorado. I thought he would be. So far, he hasn't really surpassed a lot of the concerns I had about him. But I do like him as an NBA player. I do. And I think he makes sense for this team. And I think he especially made sense to me last year when the backup big was an issue, when they had Yusuf Nurkic, and there was a lot of concerns about what they were planning to do with their backup rotation, just because there wasn't really like any sort of names who were going to fit the bill for being kind of like that backup, like 4 or 5. I don't think Walker is ultimately like, I think he's ultimately just going to be that, a rotation player with less upside than Toumani, but I really like him overall. And then last is Duop. I just don't really think there's a whole lot of upside here. I think this is the type of guy that this is the type of guy that you get this year and expect that you'll probably be dropping him next year if things don't break well for him in the offseason.
So do you think, like, I agree with you that Duop is he probably can be acquired for dirt cheap if not on wire, and he will be somewhat serviceable as a end of roster kind of guy. What do you peg his chances of sticking around in the league are after this year? Do you think he's like Olivier Sarr in OKC, end of season, gives you production and you drop him in the offseason, or do you see something a little more here?
I like that actually for Sarr now that you bring it up. I think at this point, I mean, look, we know kind of what Duop is at this point, and we've seen he's bounced around a lot of different leagues. I believe he's played in Serbia. I know he's played in the NBL. I can't think of every single place that he's played right now offhand, but I think we know at this point.
Also in China and Lebanon. I actually did a little bit of research on his journey.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, props to him for his persistence, man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. He's stuck around a long time, and I think we kind of know what he is at this point. But I really like that you brought up the example of Sarr because I think that's exactly what he can end up being, right? Is an end of bench guy who hangs around, does really well. And, one of the things about Portland that I have always liked about some of their development process and kind of the things to expect about their roster as a whole is they've always been pretty well rounded in terms of bringing guys back and kind of like who they maintain. And especially now that they just started their G League this year, the Rip City Remix, they've been really good about that. And so they've been able to maintain a lot of guys. It's something that I kind of get some confidence about with guys like Rayan Rupert, when Chris Murray was occasionally playing there and stuff like that. And it gives me kind of this hope that they like to keep their guys around and keep them just for like any sort of roles, for like the energy roles, for when things don't go well. And so I think easily Duop could end up being a third big in a good situation with this team. I think maybe if Robert Williams is for sure the guy that they'd like to bring back and keep and his health persists, I think easily Duop should be like the third best big there. I think if he ends up leaving Portland for a new situation, I think I like Duop as a backup. I think that's just kind of where he tops out as a backup, unfortunately. But absolutely, I think this guy has backup ability. It's just kind of one of those things, especially when you're in like a 16 or an 18 man league. It's just one of those things where you kind of monitor it year to year and you just kind of see how these things shake out. He's one of those guys that I think you're always just going to be having one foot out the door on in certain leagues just to see, what sticks over time.
Gotcha. Yeah, he's not for everybody, but if you're looking for some very cheap low end stuff, he can be steady. That's for sure.
Definitely.
Moving on to our next guy, I see you've got Corey Kispert on this list as a potential buy, also slightly lower end, but for contending teams. Why does Corey speak out to you as a potential asset?
So there's a few interesting things that I've seen about Corey Kispert in regards to his recent performance. He's coming off his best game of the season, and he also played his most minutes since late November. It doesn't feel like a coincidence as the deadline starts to come up, and it looks like the Wizards might be selling a good amount of guys with a lot of rumors. His most recent game and his high mark of this past year was a game where he scored 26 points, 4 rebounds, and 2 assists, and he made 6 threes, and he was 10 for 18 from the field. as I'm sure plenty of people will know who own Corey Kispert or have just kind of observed, he's a 3-point specialist, right? He's not going to get you a whole lot in other cats, but what you like about him is that he's a good scorer and he has pretty decent percentages. Um, One of the things that I found interesting this year in his third year is he's mostly been relegated to a bench role, currently with a career low 21.3 minutes per game. And what's interesting is he's still maintained a pretty good points per game status. This year, on 21 minutes, like I said, he's averaging 11.6 points per game, as opposed to last year when he was averaging 28 minutes per game and was scoring 11.1 points per game. So, kind of an interesting little thing that he's found a pocket in off the bench. And one of the things that's kind of been interesting about that is this has been a year where he started to get a little bit better at two things specifically that I've noticed. Number one, he's gotten pretty he's slightly improved in his finishing at the rim, which I found interesting. And then I've also seen that he's been taking a lot more threes on movement this year, just as a result of his role and pace. Just to set the stage a little bit, one of the things that made him work often as a starter in Washington when they had Bradley Beal and Kristaps Porzingis was whenever Beal or KP would be swarmed, he was a really good kick and to catch and shoot. And just be a really good option on the outside whenever guys had too much pressure on them. And so he was always a really good kind of stopgap, if you will. And, one of the things is he doesn't really have that upside, as we said, and he doesn't really have the fantasy game that you really want to hope for. But he's a good role player who pretty much plays good plug and play minutes on any team in the league. It's hard to really foresee him being more than like a 25 minutes per game guy on a normal basis, just on what we're seeing. But I think he's someone that a lot of teams might like. And I think he's someone that a lot of teams would want on their roster to bolster shooting, to bolster, wing depth when it comes to the playoffs. Because he's somebody who I think could be pretty good on a good situation. And that's somebody who, really needs like shooting, should be looking at. He doesn't really command a lot of value at the moment. I mean, my guess is he's maybe worth like a couple seconds. Maybe he's thrown in a package with like a Tyus Jones or a Daniel Gafford, Delon Wright. But I think he's somebody that people should be looking at for sure. I think it's easy to look at some of the other names in Washington and think, this is somebody who's going to benefit from a move, or maybe someone who's a good buy right now that can still maintain good production with marginal change. But I think Corey Kispert's one to look at for sure, and I don't think he's going to require a whole lot of, he's not going to require a whole lot to buy him at the moment. So he's one of the ones I've just been kind of interested in.
Yeah, interesting. When you first brought up Corey Kispert, I'll be honest, he's not a very exciting player. But the more I look into it, especially with all the noise around Washington offloading Kuzma, Gafford, or so there are not many pieces there that can soak up all those shots. So if they're moving off a guy like Kuzma, that opens up even more opportunity for people like Kispert. And like you said, he's been trending in a positive direction lately, in terms of both minutes and production. So he's someone that the more I looked into, the more I thought it made sense for contending teams to buy at a very affordable cost. As you said, his fantasy game isn't well rounded, but does he have potential to grow into Grayson Allen, someone like that previously had the same sort of stat set as Corey, but added better efficiency and the steals to really jump him up the rankings?
I think it's possible. I think there certainly might be a team out there that would trust in him. I think, for example, to bring up Grayson Allen, I think if you put Corey Kispert in a situation like Phoenix, where he's able to soak up a lot of minutes, just as a byproduct of either injuries or not having enough quality depth to operate around the margins. I think absolutely. I think there's definitely a chance that he finds more of the opportunity to do these things. And one of the intangibles that I like about Corey Kispert is he's always been a really good veteran leader. He was an upperclassman from Gonzaga. One of the things that I really liked about him last year, whenever the Wizards were struggling, was he was very outspoken. There's a few times in press conferences where he was very brutally honest about the performance of the team and, talking about the things that he wanted to see out of the team. And I like that leadership element of it. I think he's somebody who put in the right situation, like a Grayson Allen, perhaps on, I don't know, Milwaukee or a team that's currently winning right now, like Phoenix even. I think there's a situation where he can step up more, and in turn he's able to kind of bolster more of his fantasy game. I don't know exactly like upside wise if I trust like how much further he can go. Like I wouldn't say there's like a big hope for me personally that he's going to make some sort of like giant jump at any point, but I think absolutely, I think he could definitely become Grayson Allen for sure. I think that's not a big ask at this point.
Interesting. Okay. That's good to know that you think that because Grayson Allen was someone I feel people were pretty universally out on, and he's really been a revelation this year in terms of being in the top 80 even at this stage of the season, in terms of fantasy.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but was Grayson Allen? I'm not sure if he's currently in it, but was he for a time in the 50-40-90 club this year?
He's currently shooting 51.6% from the field and 49, a shade under 50 for from three. So he's actually almost in the 50-50-90 club. His free throw took a little bit of a dip. It's at 87.8 right now. But yeah, absolutely insane efficiency so far this year.
It's crazy. He's had quite a renaissance, and it does make you wonder about Corey Kispert. If he's able to be in this type of situation, absolutely. I think now that we've kind of unpacked this a little more, I think there's definitely a realistic avenue to where this could happen. Maybe I know we had talked about Golden State yesterday and Jonathan Kuminga. If I remember correctly, I think Golden State was interested in Kispert for a time back when he was in the pre-draft process. And I think, perhaps if they were looking to acquire veterans, maybe to kind of just build around their margins, I think that certainly could be an answer for somebody like that. But yeah, just case in point, I think this is like the type of guy that teams should be looking at pretty heavily if they can get for a good deal. I mean, to me personally, I don't know exactly like what the intention is going to be for some of these other players, because you wonder about the Tyus Jones and the Daniel Gaffords and the Delon Wrights. But you think about how cheap Corey Kispert is on his contract. I don't think he's even making like $3 million a year at this point. If you can get a guy like that tacked on to one of these other guys, I think that's huge. I mean, that's definitely something. You add a borderline starter, and then you also add someone who is a really key wing off the bench. I think that's absolutely something that a lot of teams should be looking at, and I think they will look at.
I am still a little bit skeptical of Corey's ability to be the type of defensive stopper that Grayson's kind of carved out role as, just because we haven't really seen that Corey defend at that level on the NBA level, and there might be some limitations athletically. But I do see what you're saying. He's a guy that definitely can be a positive contributor, especially on the offensive side of the ball, and makes smart plays spacing the floor and being a safety valve. So yeah, Corey Kispert, very very affordable low end option for points and threes in deeper leagues. Another name I want to throw out there for your thoughts is Larry Nance Jr. Good old Larry from the Pelicans. I personally like him as a buy for contending teams. He's a hair over 30 years old. I think he's 31 at the moment. But this year he's currently just outside the top 150 in nine cap rankings in only 17.8 minutes a game. His fantasy game is just so friendly because he doesn't hurt. He actually helps you quite a bit in field goals shooting 56.7%, and his free throw shooting is at 80 this year. So he doesn't hurt you in the percentages. And he sprinkles in rebounds, sometimes assists, a little bit of steals. When he gets 20 plus, he's had seasons where he's averaged like 1.3, 1.5 steals, I want to say around that mark. So he's someone I like to look into if I'm a contending team because I feel he's acquirable for like a top 250 dynasty guy, and he can give you top 150-ish value in the current season. What do you think about Larry?
I like this a lot. I do. I'm biased because I am a Caps guy. I've always been a fan of what Larry does. He's never been someone that I've been like uber high on, but he does the right things. Like you said, he does the things. He does them well. He doesn't hurt you. And he's smooth. And I think this is the type of guy you definitely want down the stretch. It's good to have guys that you can fall back on that not only, won't hurt you in any sort of way when they do get their minutes, but they have the skill ability for opportunity. If like a Zion Williamson goes down, let's say, or like a Jonas Valanciunas gets hurt, I think it's important that you have a guy like him who has that opportunity as things kind of come down the stretch and you don't know what's going to happen. Just for all intents and purposes. I mean, at best, he becomes a really solid player. He becomes a starter. He becomes a high 20 plus minute. At worst, he just kind of keeps doing what he's doing. He doesn't do anything to hurt you. So yeah, I love him as a buy. I think he's absolutely somebody that contenders should be. If you don't have him, I think this is definitely the time where you absolutely need to get him. Right. I think this is just the absolute time where you gotta stack up for him. So I love it. I think it's a great buy.
Right. I think this it's the right time right now, especially he's a little nicked up. He has a little bit of an ankle thing going on, so he's day to day as our recording on February 5th. I will say it's funny that you mentioned that Zion might go down and his value would also boom Larry himself, availability is probably his weakest link. That's probably the biggest knock on him as a player. So you have to kind of weigh that risk a little bit. But when he's out there, he really doesn't hurt your team at all. It's all positive. So for the right price, around the top 250 mark, if I'm a contender, I would definitely look into him. Are there any other names that you want to quickly shout out as potential buys for contenders?
I'll say I one of the guys that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, Delon Wright, I'm intrigued by as a contender. He's been a little under, I wouldn't even say underappreciated this year. I would just say just kind of overlooked as a whole, both in part to kind of what Washington's been doing right now and the injury that he suffered early on in the season, where he missed about 2 months of the first 2 months of the season. I think Delon Wright, as we saw last year, is a really, really good backup guard. He's a fantastic defender. He's somebody that I even thought could have been in the if there was ever a third team all defense that we put together, I think Delon Wright would have been someone who should have been considered if there was ever such a team for honorable mentions for all defense. He's just a really good defender, and he just he does things right. He's kind of a Larry Nance to me, where he just does the things and he just does them well. I think he's kind of an interesting price point right now. I believe he's making $8 million this year, and he's only on the hook for one more year. So he's an interesting expiring that I think a lot of contending teams should be looking at. And I think he's really ideal if you need a secondary ball handler. You just need somebody who can soak up a variety of minutes in your second unit. I think he's a good player and he's steady, and I would like to see him on a really good contending team. I'm a fan. I'm just a fan. He did a lot for me last year. I want to keep seeing him do more. He's had so many different times throughout his career where he's looked so sharp, whether that's Sacramento, whether that is, this year with Washington, or last year with Washington, I'm sorry. He's a good player, and I think he's somebody that a lot of teams will be targeting. I think it's these guys like the Corey Kisperts and the Delon Wrights who can make such a difference for a lot of teams who can be acquired for much cheaper than some of the other ones might be. So I'm intrigued by Delon Wright. I think he might be worthwhile if you can get him off waivers or get him for dirt cheap right now, especially if you need the steals.
Absolutely. I think he was. I want to say he was top five in steals per game in the NBA last year. Could you quickly check that for me? Yeah, 1.8 last year was the average. As a Mavs fan, I guess I'm biased against Delon. He's probably one of the biggest fail of Haralabob's career over there. He was like the biggest free agent guy he brought in. He didn't really work out in Dallas, but after that Dallas stop, he really has revitalized his his career as a defensive point of attack guard stopper, and he was awesome last year and in the previous stints before that as well. This year, obviously, the injury sidelined him for the first, I want to say, couple months of the year. So he's been coming around slowly. But if the Wizards either hang on to him and ship out the guards for picks and stuff, and he gets more opportunity, I can absolutely see a world in which Delon, goes back to a 20-minute around 20-minute per night kind of role and gives you 1.4 steals, and that's immensely valuable in a deeper league. So yeah, definitely someone to consider. All right, let's move into a, a very juicy name. In fact, it's so controversial. I will read off some stats that this player has compiled this year and see if the listeners or you that can guess who this is. So per B-Ball Index, this player is number fourth in the entire NBA in drive assist rate percentage, number six in log passing creation rate, number seven in rim shot creation. He's the number two guard in defensive positional versatility, and the number four guard in pickpocket rating. And after slumping to start the year, he averaged 16.3 points, 4.6 assists, 1.6 steals on almost 50% shooting and 44.4% from three. Can you take a stab at who I'm talking about, Zach?
Oh, I know exactly who you're talking about here. You're talking about Mr. Talen Horton-Tucker.
Yeah, I can't get anything past you, Zach. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Good old THT. Uh, Definitely a very divisive name in the fantasy community. He's someone I would definitely consider as a rebuilding asset to consider, and I would be looking into acquiring him from whoever's disgruntled that he's piled up 10 DNPs in the last 2 weeks or month, or he's not been seeing the court at all because Hardy's point guard carousel right now favors Chris Dunn all of a sudden. So I just think that he's not making his way onto all these metrics as, by chance. He's not, there's no way he's fluking his way onto all these, different facets of the game. He definitely has something there, some juice. And when you watch him play, he is out of control at times, but with his athleticism and his long limbs, he can get into the lane at will. And although he will throw up the wild shot here and there, he also has that vision to find, Walker Kessler on that backdoor cut or John Collins. He has that passing touch and has flashed it over and over again when he's been given ample opportunity. Is THT someone that you would look into a little bit, or are you firmly on the THT sucks train?
So here's where I'm at, right? Just like you had said, he's not on these lists for no reason. It's you'd be hard pressed to look at this list. I mean, for example, you look at the lob passing creation rate, like you mentioned. I mean, this list is, it's Trae Young, it's LaMelo Ball, it's Luka, it's Spencer Dinwiddie, it's Chris Middleton, and then it's THT at 6, right? Right below is Mike Conley, James Harden, Cade Cunningham, and Darius Garland. So, just like you said, it's hard to believe that he would just be on these lists for absolutely no reason, or just for some sort of arbitrary caveats, right? He's on this list, and he has shown these things that are really good. It's pretty unbelievable that he's such a straight, just a dog in like all these advanced stats, and he just manages to, fit the bill for what teams will want on a key piece on paper. I think my question is just, does he really fit the bill as a full player, And one of the things that I've always wondered about him is just like how he keeps looking from the eye test, which as we've seen in some of the bad moments, he has these super low moments where he just doesn't stand out. He's had these moments where he's looked like a poor shooter. He's offered a lot of concern in the basketball IQ department. He's had a lot of just really sloppy moments and kind of just silly, like I would refer to as like silly hero ball moments. But then you kind of see like these things where he just kind of looks so sharp, and you think there's got to be something there, particularly in this year with Utah. And in mention to how he was playing in December, like you said, I saw improvements in the shot selection. He's been a really good passer as we've routinely seen. He just kind of seems like a generally improved playmaker in this role. He's always been a really decent defender, and so you just see these things, and you're just like, there's got to be something there. And I think at this point, with all these DNPs, I think he's absolutely a buy for rebuild context. I think he's somebody you just kind of take on a chance, and if you can get him for a good price, I think now is definitely the time. Because look, he's got these concerns, but I think it would be a little surprising if he just completely fell out of the league next year, for as much as people do not like him. And to be sure, there's a lot of people who do not like him, especially online, right? This is just the kind of guy that you should hopefully get and just kind of hope for the best on things. Because like I said, these things pop up, and these things are being shown that he can be a good player. It's just, you wonder exactly like how much things can be put together collectively is my thing.
Yeah, for sure. People are very vitriolic in what they say about THT. They absolutely hate this guy. It must have something to do with the clutch sports and the Lakers effect. But yeah, this guy, I will admit that he started off the year extremely poor. You're absolutely right. There are times where he can't hit a shot and he's still jacking them up. But that December run was really encouraging, and it really brought me back to what he flashed at the end of last year as well. This December run wasn't really out of the blue. He also showed it at the end of last year as well. So this is someone who has the ability, has shown it on multiple occasions, is only 23, and that run was within the top 100, and you could probably acquire him for around that same top 250 Dynasty asset market, if not even lower. And so this is a higher upside buy than even Larry Nance. It could very well turn into, it doesn't even have to be a rebuilding asset. He could be a contributor if he moves to a place like San Antonio, or even somewhere like Charlotte, where he's playing 25 to 30 minutes a game. He will put up numbers, and if his shooting in December holds up even a little bit, that is a very solid fantasy player. And one last thing I will note is that, he's obviously a bowling ball who gets into the lane and takes all these difficult layups. His rim finishing has also improved this year because he's worked on his left hand. So this is a player who obviously thinks very highly of himself. I sometimes dub this as the too skillful effect, where a player, his bag is so deep and he can do so many things on the court that sometimes he doesn't do the simple thing, and it looks really funky and low IQ to others. So he's only 23, so if he can figure that out a little bit, I think he has a lot of potential, and the price is so low that it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think the price is appealing to me right now. It's like I said earlier, it would be hard to believe that he just falls out of the league at this point. Even for as much as people are so vile about him in some ways. I like that you pegged the San Antonio Spurs as a possible destination because I think that's exactly where he'd be somewhere or somewhere that he would thrive. This is somewhere where maybe he could just play off the bench. He could be a second unit point guard even, where he is able to maintain this kind of like steadier role. He's able to operate a little more like off ball. He kind of has this easy, as such a good rim shot creator. That's like, I mean, that's a match made in heaven for someone like Wemby, right? I mean, that just makes a lot of sense. And I think with long arms, I mean, think about like how crazy that would look on the perimeter, right?
That would be the dream destination for THG in my opinion. Yeah, he also dropped 41 on them last year, so hopefully they look at more into the game tape and the metrics here, frankly, and realize that there's something to be had.
The big message that I think that people should know. I know people are going to hear this and they're going to think, THT is not him. He's not the guy that you should go after. He sucks. I know people are going to be thinking that for sure. The most important thing you can see right now is that when he gets his opportunity, he's doing the right things and he's continuing to do the right things that make you think there's a good player. And he's absolutely due for an opportunity elsewhere. He's going to be cheap right now as far as a dynasty asset, but he's also going to be cheap in terms of his contract, which I believe is up next year as an unrestricted free agent, if I remember correctly.
I do think he's entering free agency this offseason. So this trade deadline is pretty big for him, I feel, in terms of finding a home and establishing his value.
Definitely, yeah. I think the baseline is just that he's due for an opportunity elsewhere, and he definitely can find an opportunity elsewhere. I think somewhere like San Antonio, where you have someone like Greg Popovich and such a well-rounded coaching staff around him that can help him work on this role where he's able to thrive in less minutes. He has less shots while continuing to operate on the things that he's good at, which are being a good playmaker and being a good defender. I just think that this is the type of guy you just have to get, and you have to believe that it's someone who can only go up from here. And we've seen such good things. I mean, you have to think that at this point, this is the type of guy that you take a chance on in a rebuild. I'm not gonna say that this is the type of guy who has like a Laurie Marketing glow up with a moving team. Far from it. But I think this is absolutely the type of guy where you can look and you can see that it feels abundantly clear that this is someone who can benefit a lot from something new. And so I think that's exactly what's gonna end up happening is he's gonna find a new home and he's gonna do well.
Absolutely, because sometimes you have to weigh the acquisition cost, and then you consider the range of outcomes. I don't think him PhD becoming this outer worldly starting point guard is a high probability of success, but he's someone that you can't really rule it out for, considering all these metrics, all these lists that he's on, and all the flashes he's shown. And for the cost right now, like a top 250, top 300 type of dynasty guy. Even if PhD flushes out of the league, you really aren't missing out on much. You didn't trade a top 100 player for him. It really doesn't hurt. And so when you weigh the cost versus the upside, it's a no-brainer.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And this is the kind of shots you take. This is the kind of shots that you take to go from a rebuilder to a building up your contending team. There's all kinds of these moves sometimes that you just have to take the risk on and hope that there's something better you can get out of it, whether it's for something flippable or it's something that just becomes really good for you. And yeah, this is exactly the kind of guy I think people should be targeting for that exact reason.
All right, I think that's enough about THT. THT haters, you guys can put away your pitchforks. I won't talk any more about them. Let's move on to our next guy. Zach, you have any young assets that you would consider for rebuilding teams?
I do. I have one in particular. It's going to be we're very guard themed in some of these rebuilding assets, which I think is interesting, and I think it's a good time to buy some of these guys just because I mean it's kind of the general theme of these guys. They've shown the opportunity before. They don't have the opportunity now, and they need the opportunity again. And in that same theme, my next guy is going to be Bones Hyland. Played for the Nuggets, had his little drama there. Didn't really play up to par, and wasn't really a Michael Malone type of guy for better or worse. He moved to the Clippers last trade deadline, and he looked pretty good as a heater off the bench, both last year and this year. And he's had his moments, but it seems like since the Harden trade, he's just kind of fallen out of the rotation. But despite the field goal percentage, he's a really good scorer and he has shown a decent passing ability off the bench. He's flashed plenty of potential in Denver and in LA. He's looked good at times, and even though he's had some concerns about his defense, he's kind of a black hole sometimes on offense. Maybe he kind of is what he is at this point, is just kind of a heat checker. Maybe at best you can hope for like a 6-man type, but I think he's shown he is a good player, and I think he's shown that he can do things effectively for a team. I think at this point it just kind of takes a new opportunity for someone who's going to use him consistently, and maybe that's a rebuilding team at this point. But I think he's a good piece to trade right now. I would imagine that LA is probably looking to move on from him. At this point, what they should be hoping for is that they can use the remaining assets, just kind of tool around their team. I mean, they're really great right now, and they've been on a hot streak, and so I think it would be silly to play Bones at this point just because it's worked, and I get that. And I think what the smart thing would be at this point is just to trade him off, and so I'm very interested in him in a new destination at this point. I'm not sure exactly how much more upside he has going forward, but I think he definitely has some, to be sure. And I think he's somebody that I'm very interested in going forward if he can get on the right opportunity.
Yeah, Bones is definitely a name to monitor at the trade deadline if he moves somewhere where he can actually see the court. He did look pretty good starting out in his Clippers tenure, but once Harden came over, he was a victim of the Ty Lue false promise. I remember the first press conference after Harden came over. Ty Lue promised him that he would figure out minutes for him after the rotations kind of settled down, and surprise, surprise, he's not playing anymore. Like you said, he does have a lot of skill. Yeah, the NBA is just flushed with all these skilled guards that lack opportunity. And, whether you interpret that as, these guards don't have as much value because these opportunities are limited and they might just wash out. But you could also look at the flip side of the token where if they actually latch on and someone believes in them, they can really put up solid fantasy numbers because fantasy is a pretty guard-friendly game, especially if you can pass the ball, hit the three, get a little bit of sprinkle a little bit of steals here and there. So I think Bones is a name to monitor for sure. Are there any destinations in particular where you would like to see him headed?
So this is tough, right? I think this is one of the things that I've thought about a lot. It's one of those things where you kind of get a little scared about what he is as a player. He, like I've said, he's small, he's not a good defender. He can kind of be a black hole in offense with, the ball in his hands. There's a lot of concerns that you have about what he is and what maybe he can be. Um Especially with the current outlook of the NBA and a lot of these guard types. I think I referred earlier to the possibility of a rebuilding team that might have some interest in him. And I think what I've kind of reached the conclusion on is my favorite destination for him would probably be Washington. I think he'd be a really good offensive spark plug off the bench. I think when you look at what they're trying to do with Jordan Poole and Tyus Jones right now. Now, mind you, there's a lot of things that are going to change likely with Washington. You don't know if Tyus Jones is going to stay. You don't know exactly what the move is going to be with Jordan Poole in terms of the long-term interest in him. A lot of questions. But I think one of the things that does interest me is that the intention is going to be just finding the upside that they can. And I think it's going to be just building around the margins where they can because they have so many holes in their overall team. They're going to require some time. And I think the time that they will require means that they have the opportunity to develop guys. You look at someone like Bilal Coulibaly, like we talked about yesterday, he's a ways away from developing a lot of polish, but there's a lot of promise there to be sure. And I think this is the opportunity someone like Bones could have where, he's able to see the court early and he's able to see the court often because of how much Washington just generally needs help. So I think Washington would be a really good one. One trade I'd kind of just mocked up. I'm not really like I'm not a master of Fanspo or the trade machine, so this is just kind of something I cooked up. But I almost wonder if there's something like, for example, maybe Delon Wright for Bones, maybe like some contract filler. I guess that could be somewhere you throw in maybe like an Amir Coffee and any kind of second. They have I believe they have 2 late seconds this year. I think they're probably going to convey to whoever the highest is of like Cleveland, Indiana, maybe Milwaukee. I'd have to look for sure, but they definitely have some late seconds. So I think that would be something really good for both sides where they're able to give Bones the opportunity. They're able to get, bits and pieces of assets that they can do with what they will. And a contending team can get the piece that they want as a bench ball handler. So yeah, I guess I would generally say My hope at this point is that he goes to a rebuilding team that has the time for him, because it seems like every single team that he's been on so far, while he's looked good in stretches, they just don't seem to have the time for what he offers. So I think ultimately that's just what I hope, is that he goes to like a Washington or maybe like a San Antonio or something like that that just has the time of day for what he can build off of.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. We'll check in a week and see if your trade has come to fruition. And let's move on to our third name on the list. And we'll continue our theme of very young players who have shown promise and is also a guard. This time it's Tre Mann of the OKC Thunder. This is a guy that to me has shown extremely special shot creation abilities. And he's just one of those guys, if you watch the highlights, only watch the highlights, you would think that, he's already a star in the NBA because the way he's able to create off the bounce, he has the step back, he has the crossover, he can get into the lane, and he had some special dunks over posterizing dunks on good defenders. So one of the knocks on him was, the poor decision making at times. And I would say the biggest thing that hurt him was that huge shooting slump in his sophomore year that saw him fall out of the rotation as, OKC started getting a little bit of momentum and starting to build that contending core that they had. He had a lot of momentum going into the sophomore year, coming off a good stretch at the end of his rookie year, where in the preseason of the sophomore year, he was averaging a high, almost 20 points, I want to say, hitting a lot of shots. And it looked like he, if not a starting two guard alongside SGA, it looked like he would at least be, a pivotal part of that puzzle, as even the first guard off the bench to hit some threes and space the floor and do some secondary playmaking. But he just couldn't hit any shots last year and fell out of favor. So he's largely been forgotten, in my opinion, with his draft pedigree and what he's shown and how he's looked in the little time that he's been out there this year. He is someone that could really blow up if he has moved to a rebuilding situation, like you said, like a Spurs or to the Wizards, because his shot creation ability, I want to go back to that, is, I want to say, top 5 percentile in the NBA. And it's a matter of knocking down that shot after you create it to, really win people over. So he's going to have to do that on a more consistent basis, a lot more consistent basis to turn people around on his reputation. But he's so good that, even Damian Lillard shouted him out as one of the guys that reminds him of Anthony Simons, who also took 2 or 3 years to put the whole entire package together and to figure out when to push and pull on the offensive end and to be effective in that sense. So what do you think of Tre Mann?
I love that you brought that up. I think there's definitely something there to what Dame says, and I've always been a Tre Mann lover. I've always thought super highly of him. I'm a University of Florida very avid watcher over the years, and he's been somebody I was absolutely sold on there at the time. He's a good player when you see him there. He's a great shot creator. He completely melts competition in the G League. He's had so many great flashes, and even at the NBA level this year, when he's been getting the minutes and when he plays, he's looked good still. He's made some bits of progress in some of the concern areas of his playmaking and just kind of bulking up. Even despite the fact that he's never going to be much of a good defender, and his size will always kind of make him a target, just kind of by product of what sort of player he is. I like the trends he's made. I think the unfortunate thing, maybe similar to someone like Alexei Pokusevsky and maybe Usman Jang, he's just kind of falling victim to falling out of OKC's timeline just because of how stacked they are, especially the stacked backcourt and OKC's needs as a full player. He just hasn't really been the type of guy that's been able to put it all together in one package. I think, there's not a far off reality where he could be a key piece right now if things kind of just broke better for him. And I like that you brought up the shooting slump in his sophomore year, because I think there's absolutely a reality where if he figures it out sooner, that he would be possibly in the rotation right now. You never know. I think I definitely agree. I think this is the type of guy that needs to go to a rebuilding team as well, just like Bones. I think this is the type of guy with more to show. And I think in some ways, I'm almost a little more eager to see what's in the tank for Tre Mann as opposed to someone like Bones Hyland. I think there's a lot more questions that you have with Tre, and I think there might be more that you can unlock, is kind of what I'm thinking. I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but I really like Tre Mann. I do. I've been kind of thinking about this, and I just want to get your read on this. Do you think there's a potential archetype if he moves teams to where he could be someone like maybe a campaign, maybe a Jeremy Lamb, where he's able just to kind of become a late bloomer that finds the right home as a rotation piece?
I think I might sound like a bit of a homer here, but I think his potential upside is higher, much higher than the two guys that you just mentioned. I would put him closer to the group of the. I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I feel if you were to put it on a spectrum, he would be closer to Anthony Simons and Kobe White on the high end than the campaign on the lower end. I think his range of outcomes, his potential is much higher than the campaign Jeremy Lambs of the NBA world. If you look at his, it's pretty funny. He's actually part of the 50-40-100 club in 9 minutes this year. So, that efficiency, it's an extremely small sample size, but he's shown he can do it. Like you said, he absolutely melts competition in the G League. He's been averaging elevated steals numbers there too, which bodes well for, projecting his defensive growth, as limited as it might be. If he can chip in one like a steal a game, that would do wonders for his fantasy value as well. And he has added a little bit of bulk to his frame, and as these guards usually do. So yeah, I think with his ability to create his own shot, I'm being a dead drum here, but it's so impressive. His high end outcome is much higher than the campaigns and the Jeremy Lambs, and I can see a world where he can become like a Anthony Simons light, or someone that can be a very strong spark plug, 6 man off the bench that can average 15, 16 points per game in a winning fashion.
Okay, I like this. I like this take a lot. I really do. You've sold me, sir. You have.
I'm selling a lot of damaged goods. I will say that, like the THTs and the Tre Manns. I am very selective in my valuation though. I try really hard to back up, what my eye test is telling me. So I've looked into this, and I think it is on solid ground that for the price and the cost and the potential outcome, these are two guys that I really really like for rebuilding teams to take a stab at.
And I'll say too, there was a lot of rumors this previous offseason that he might have been one of the people who would end up being cut by OKC to make their roster conform. And as with a lot of these guys who were in rumors for being like cut and stuff like that, there was a lot of people who were kind of circling like vultures, trying to see who OKC would end up cutting so that they could secure some of the good names. And Tre Mann was one of them. Tre Mann was one of the guys who people thought might have been a cut candidate. And it's kind of interesting that, and good that he wasn't. I never thought personally that he was someone that they should ever consider cutting. But it is interesting to see that there was legitimate interest in him in the league in other places. And I think it would be silly of me to not say that he's at least worth a key bench spot on pretty much any other team in the league that isn't as stacked as OKC is kind of where I land ultimately.
Let's move on to another name on our list. Our last young guard, rounding it out, is AJ Griffin. This is someone I feel I might be a little lower on than you are, but I'm curious what you have to say about him.
Yeah, AJ Griffin, victim of Jalen Johnson exploding onto the scene. He had so many good moments last year. I think, the important thing is that he's not much outside of a good scorer. He doesn't really have the interesting thing is that it seems like, despite the potential that you see here as a scorer, he just doesn't have the things that his teammates have that makes him fall out of the rotation. And it makes sense when you kind of break it down. Outside of just being a good scorer, he doesn't have playmaking upside, unlike Jalen Johnson. He's not really doing anything as a defender, unlike Jalen and Saddiq Bey. He doesn't really offer a lot of numbers across the board, unlike the two. And he also doesn't really show a lot of scalability unless he gets the ball in his hands, which at this point, it's not going to happen. It's a team that has Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, Jalen Johnson, Bojan Bogdanovic, so on and so forth, right? He's just a guy who's been really underused this season after such a hot start. Part of that is the Jalen Johnson explosion. And one of the things I had noticed too, once Quinn Snyder had taken over, is there was this sort of preference about Saddiq Bey once they had acquired him. And I think it makes sense, as you've seen Saddiq Bey kind of thrive as a good piece in Atlanta's system. I think he's kind of found a nice little niche as a player here and as someone who just fits really well in the front court. And I think it just makes sense. He does a lot of stuff well, and I think he definitely does stuff better than AJ Griffin. Now, granted, AJ is very young. He doesn't turn 21 until August 2024. He's a really good athlete, and he still just kind of needs some time to keep working on things in general. Even for the good flashes that we saw of his scoring last year, I think it was obvious that there was concerns. He's not a great track record of being very fantasy friendly, especially from what we saw in college basketball. He relies a lot on his athleticism for things when he's already had 2 knee surgeries and nagging knee and ankle stuff at Duke in high school. So you kind of wonder about some of his injury and rehab habits and the things that he continues to build on. And his good highlights still show holes in his game, and he's just kind of someone who has fallen behind as a result of the pace for his teammates. And so, there's a lot of concerns that I have for sure. And I've seen good things out of him, but you just kind of wonder exactly what his future looks like. But I think what interests me about him in particular is buying him for rebuilding at this point. Atlanta is just at such a crossroads with their future. DeJounte Murray is really involved in the trade talks. There's a lot of things that they have to figure out. I think at this point, the only pieces that really should likely remain relatively untouchable are going to be Trae Young and Jalen Johnson. Even then, you kind of do wonder about the Trae Young stuff. Maybe if he's just not their guy. I just think ultimately what's interesting to me about him is that he could be coming at the time where he gets an opportunity if they decide to just finally go in a rebuild direction, and just kind of feature more of the young guys. It gives me some interesting thoughts. I mean, I think there's definitely a reality where he ends up being, reclaiming some of his spot that he had last year. But then there's definitely a possibility that Atlanta ends up pawning him off in some other pieces to maybe get a veteran piece that helps them compete more. And maybe he finds a new home elsewhere. I think there's definitely a possibility of either of those things. And I think at this point, with how little we've seen of AJ this year, it's hard to lose, right? Like, I think this is the type of guy you buy and you hope can just get back to like where he was. And I mean, he's a buy low, so you wonder if, maybe he goes lower, maybe he goes higher. But I think this is the type of guy where it's a little hard and to lose out on, and it's kind of low risk to the point where if you buy him for a good enough price, maybe he becomes something. I would say of the opportunity coming forth, I think he definitely probably has, in my opinion, maybe the highest upside, maybe the second highest upside compared to Talen, from the guys we had talked about. But I think I just kind of worry about the floor ultimately. I think very high upside potentially, but I think the floor is low at this point in time.
Interesting. For me, I just the fact that we haven't seen him, rebound, assist, or contribute any defensive stats in the NBA, it kind of gives me pause on projecting his high-end upside. I do wonder if, the knees and the ankle stuff at Duke has sapped some of that athleticism. We've seen players like Harry Giles on the worst possible injury situation, that kind of goes and doesn't really come back even though they're young. So that kind of that makes me wary of, projecting AJ as someone who can, become a starter level player in the NBA. I will say last year was promising. There was some hype building in the fantasy dynasty community because of his shooting splits. He knocked down threes. There was a statistic, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but he was on a very exclusive list of, hitting certain, I want to say, certain efficiency numbers. He was second only to Kyrie Irving in as a shooter for rookies. So this is someone who demonstrated an ability to shoot the lights out of the ball, but to me doesn't do enough of anything else in a fantasy sense for me to really get excited about as a prospect. I'm wondering, you are our resident draft and scouting extraordinaire, so you're much more in tune with the college game than I am. Did Griffin do more things than he has done in the NBA in terms of the other facets of his game that gives you, a little more optimism in terms of him rounding out what he does?
I think at this point, I haven't really seen a lot of it. I think, you look back at some of the numbers, and I'll read off a few here just to kind of illustrate some of my point. I think my feeling is that I was hoping he would do more, as someone who is 6'6" and 222 pounds, coming out of school. And I would imagine probably, around that to this day. He was somebody that I always hoped would do more, and that I always kind of expected to improve in certain ways. So, when he was in college at a single season in Duke, he put up 10.4 points per game, 3.9 rebounds, 1 assist, zero point 0.5 steals, zero point 0.5 blocks, and zero point 0.6 turnovers. And that shooting split wise, we're looking at 49.3% from the field, 44.7% from three, and 79.2% from the free throw line. And so, for me, one of the things I'd always kind of hoped was that nothing else was really going to come along, in my opinion. He was never much of a defender. He had this, freakish athleticism that it seems like he uses for scoring. Doesn't really translate as much for, rebounds even. He doesn't seem to just do a lot for fantasy. I think this is the type of guy that you want more for points leagues than anything else, unfortunately. And there's a use for him, right? Absolutely in points leagues, but I just don't think there's ever going to be these things that he can do in terms of being a really good nightcap player. I think unfortunately, he's just always going to be more of a scorer at this juncture, just kind of based on what we've seen. And there's a use for him. I mean, there's definitely a world where he can be a good player still, but it makes you wonder for sure. It definitely makes you wonder after such a hot rookie year, just kind of how we're going to see this go. But yeah, to your point, I don't think unfortunately there's ever going to be a whole lot we're going to see in the stats department from him.
I see. Yeah, I'm looking at the splits now, and yeah, that is hyper efficient, turning the ball over only 0.6 times a game, and shooting 44% from three on high volume, and even the blocks and the steals 0.6 and 0.5. I mean, they're not high, but it's not something that to absolutely scoff at. Considering he's only 20 and turning 21, he's the youngest of the four guards we've discussed, right?
Yes, I believe he is the youngest at this current time. I think yeah, I think so he's definitely the youngest by like a year, I would say. I think the next youngest might be Bones, I would like to say. But yeah, he's very young considerably speaking. Like I said, like he's not going to be turning 21 until August of this year. So he's definitely got his time to figure things out for sure. He's a young guy, and I'm sure, there's a lot of things that he needs to just kind of work on in terms of learning the game and just kind of working on his overall his skills in the league.
All right, all right. Yeah, I guess I'm not going to completely write him off. And I think given what he showed in his rookie year, he could be someone to acquire for a very cheap cost and just before the deadline, just to see the direction that Atlanta is heading in. Just as a fun exercise, these names that we're talking about, the variance is very high and the range of outcomes is unpredictable. It's almost a matter of personal preference. So how would you rank the four guards that we mentioned? Bones, AJ Griffin, Tre Mann, and THT?
That is a really good question. I think, I mean, that is a very close one. I think, if I'm gauging for upside combined with what they've shown so far, I think they're all somewhat close for me. I think currently, right this second, I would rank them as this is exclusively in terms of dynasty assets, to be clear. For what I see for them going forward, I think what I see is, I think my number one is AJ Griffin by not a lot. I think number two is THT. And I think what gives me some pause, and especially that I need to have THT at 2, is THT has a better fantasy game ultimately than AJ Griffin. It's kind of just a difference for what I view as upside for each of them that kind of separates, that kind of splits the difference in that regard. So for dynasty assets, I'm AJ number 1, THT number 2. I think I might be Tre Mann number 3, but possibly. It's really close between and Bones, and then I think Bones I just have to put at 4. And that's nothing on Bones either. I think these are all guys who I would probably categorize in between, like, I mean, I'll have an arbitrary number out there because I'm not sure yet. I'm working on my dynasty rankings right now for Digital Dynasty Sports, but this is just kind of a thing I'm throwing out there. I think these are all guys I view somewhere in between top 180 and top I'll say like 240. I think these are all guys who are within like pretty close reach of each other, relatively speaking. There's definitely, I think the biggest difference for sure would be my thought between THT and Tre Mann. But even then I don't think it's really like a wide difference. So yeah, just a recap. So AJ Griffin 1, THT 2, Tre Mann 3, and Bones Hyland is 4 for me. What about you?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, well, absolutely not a knock on any of these guys in any sort of rank, as you said, because they are in that same group range right now in the dynasty sense. Interestingly enough, that you mentioned that you're pitting them around the 180 to 240 range, and I think that goes to illustrate the opportunity to buy low here because even in our conservative estimations, they are still relatively outside the top 200. So they could a lot of these guys can be had for pretty almost nothing. Like a 2024 second, which projected right now is a weak class. In a deep league, a second rounder in the 2024 or one of these guys, I think I would go ahead and take a shot at one of these young guards, in my opinion. But if I were to rank them, I think I would personally have THT first, probably, and then Tre Mann second, Bone third, AJ Griffin last. It might be a little controversial and unorthodox, but to me, I'm more so considering their production if they got value, if they got the opportunity in terms of fantasy value. So in terms of each of these guys played 25 minutes and were like an every night rotation kind of guy, like how would their stat set project? And to me, THT, he can hit a couple threes. His wingspan allows him to project to be like a very disruptive defender. Um, he can score at will at times, and he can pass the ball very well. So I feel like that kind of guy probably has a higher ceiling and fantasy wise compared to someone like AJ Griffin, and that's why I ranked it the way I did. But yeah, as I said, at this point in dynasty rankings, it's completely a matter of personal preference.
Where I always, for me, always, when I build dynasty ranks and whenever I'm trying to think about these little, nuggets of information as far as like what we're able to project outward, this is always a tough time of year because, guys can kind of sway so wildly. I mean, there's an easy situation where, Talen Horton-Tucker could end up going from like, you could easily sway from somewhere like a 150, even like up to like a 140, 130 or something like that, way down to like, like a 240, 250 if things don't break even. And this is always what's kind of tough about some of this stuff and why it's you look for these things that are low risk in that regard because there's always going to be the hope that there's a right opportunity that comes. And these guys are smart. Front offices are smart, even though I know people like to believe that they can be armchair GMs with some of this stuff, but these guys are smart and they know that there's things that they can get out of these guys. And so,
Hey man, give us a team and we'll run the league.
exactly, yeah.
I say that half-heartedly, but yeah, we people don't give GM and front office enough credit. They're not perfect, but you're right. Their evaluations, they have whole teams working on this stuff. So
They do, and so I'm trusting that some of these buy lows are what they are with their low risk, but I think definitely these are the type of guys that you should be looking at right now, for sure. I think there's opportunities for them, and I think people know that there's going to be good opportunities for them. So, yeah, I'm a fan of all these guys, and I think these are all guys who are going to be grouped pretty closely for me for the next couple days. And I'm really fascinated to see how this little amalgamation of guards breaks out in the remainder of the year.
yeah, fingers crossed for these guys and for our fantasy teams that some of them find new homes and get some minutes. Minutes are the currency, are the most valuable currency in fantasy for sure. Let's close out our segment for rebuilding assets with a front court guy and a veteran to completely switch it up. I see you got here Brandon Clarke. You want to talk a little bit about Brando?
I would love to talk about Brandon Clarke. One guy who's just kind of he's always been a little bit of a my guy. He's not perfect for sure. He's got some concerns. He's a little undersized as a five. He's not really great at playing the four, with just kind of a sus little shooting streak to him. I think there's I think there's possibility for him in that regard, but I think he's always been one of those guys. He kind of reminds me of someone like an EJ Liddell, for example, where he kind of there's questions about the position and what they are. You can see that they're guys who are versatile, but you don't know exactly like where the puzzle piece sometimes can fit. But I think he's definitely shown that he's a good player, and I think Memphis has already given a good seal of approval, especially with the contract that he earned, that he is a good part of their future. Now, some of what changed with that, and some of my concerns are he had a Achilles tear this past, I believe it is April or May, or not May, I'm sorry, March, I believe. So we're coming up on almost a calendar year that he's been out for. And you kind of wonder exactly.
He's aiming to come back and before the end of the season, right? I think I saw a report he's aiming to come back sometime in March.
That's right. Yeah. One of the things that is really, I wouldn't say like bizarre per se, but is a little sketchy to me is Memphis is always one of those teams that's a little bit wishy-washy on injury stuff and like reporting. I'm sure plenty of our listeners will probably remember a few years ago with the Jaren Jackson debacle, as far as when he'd be coming back. We've seen some different mixed things about John Morant and his timelines over the years. We've seen just kind of some strange things.
Even Desmond Bain with his grade 3, we don't even know if it's grade 3 if he's practicing already.
That's true. That's a good point. Yeah. A lot of weird things with some of how Memphis does things, but one of the things that's kind of fascinated me about this approach with Brandon Clarke is their GM Zach Kleiman has shown an interesting level of trust about Brandon Clarke's recovery, and he's been saying, especially even dating back to the offseason in June and July of 2023, that Brandon Clarke is processing really well, and he is likely to play again this season. And Brandon Clarke even said back in December of 2023 that he intends to make his debut around like the All-Star break, which it's coming up pretty quick, 11 days from now, when that kicks off, if I'm looking at the date correctly. there's a lot of things that can kind of change that now with the onslaught of Memphis's injuries. And I mean, it's gotten pretty crazy at this point to where guys like Matthew Hurt and Scottie Pippen Jr. are making their mark, which is pretty crazy. But so one of the things that I'm just kind of wondering about Brandon Clarke is, despite this positive news, you kind of wonder not only where he's going to be at rest of season, if we're even going to see him rest of season at this point, but it also kind of gives you this wonder about the Achilles as a whole. Brandon Clarke's always been someone who's just kind of relied on athleticism in his game. He's always been a fantastic athlete. And one of the scary things sometimes about Achilles is, whether it could sap any of the athleticism. And so you kind of have some fear that maybe things change for Brandon Clarke. Maybe, for a little bit, he just kind of struggles because he has to, kind of play it safe. And, the mental aspect of recovering from Achilles, I'm sure is an extremely difficult thing, as we've seen documented from other Achilles injuries in the past. Ultimately, I've really liked what I've seen from Brandon Clarke. I've always been someone who has been a fan, but always kind of been wanting more and more in terms of fantasy. Whether it comes in full, it's hard to say for sure, but I think he's an interesting player. I think now, especially with the recent Steven Adams trade to the Houston Rockets, I'm not sure what this means, if anything, and I'd love to kind of hear what you think about that. There's a lot of questions we have about Brandon Clarke, but I think this is the type of guy that's good to buy now before these things, because there's a still chance that you can buy him for cheap. And in the interest of maybe holding him on your IR and just kind of seeing where he's at next year, I think this is a good opportunity to get someone who you can stash and just kind of see how things play out. Because maybe things go well for him. Maybe all of this reporting that things are going really well is legitimate, and he does come back and indeed is still the athlete that he was. And so I'd love to hear what you think about Brandon Clarke. There's a lot of question marks about this one, probably the most question marks of any of these guys we've talked about, but I think he's someone who could end up being like possibly the highest risk reward of the guys we've talked about. I don't know. I'd love to hear what you think.
I do like Brandon Clarke quite a bit, especially as someone who's based in Vancouver. Brado is Vancouverite, fellow Vancouverite. So I've always been a little bit partial to him. For his sake, I pray that the Memphis front office is being transparent and true in their words that he's progressing well, because I've been completely scarred by what happened to Steven Adams with his rehab on his right knee. Waited all off season. They said it was progressing well, going to be a key cog this year, and not even the first game, he already has season-ending surgery. So yeah, for Brandon's sake, I do hope that he's well on his way back to the court, and I would say that he's younger than Steven, so there's reason for optimism there. Like you said, his game is pretty predicated on athleticism, as an undersized 5. So he was already not really producing at the insane level of defensive stats that he was in college. But if that goes down even more, it could be a concern for fantasy managers. But he's a smart player. He'll find a way to contribute on that end. And given Memphis' situation this year, they'll need some smart players to bridge the gap and handhold some of these rookies and these two-way guys and transition them into next year. So Clarke does come back sometime in March. He'll give you a little bit of production, but like you said, this is a buy for rebuilding teams, so like more so for next year. Coming off next year will be more than year and a half, so a year and a half removed from his Achilles injury. Hopefully he'll be ready to play without limitations by then, and he can be someone similar to Larry Nance Jr. in the regard that he'll definitely help your field goals, chip in some steals and blocks. Hopefully the athleticism holds a little bit there, and yeah, for the price, I don't see why not. This is a guy that's you can easily root for, so I like it.
Yeah, I think it's hard to see this one, even for the concerns of Achilles. It's hard to see this one as really much of a risk at this point, because I think this is probably the lowest he's ever realistically, like in this point, is going to be. I think he's, like you said, he's someone who just as I've talked about with multiple guys, he just does the things well, and when he's doing them well, I mean he's just a good guy to have. It's hard to kind of find some of those guys, and I think there's always I've had my concerns, and I'll talk about this in just a second, I had my concerns about what Memphis looks like long term on their roster, but I think it's pretty clear at this point that he is a guy that is important to the fabric of this team. And I think he kind of speaks to a lot of the skill sets that the team possesses and kind of the things that they are looking to build in terms of, out kind of around the margins. Hard to say even around the margins because he's been a very good starter at points when he has started. But he's just one of those guys that I think just works for the team. He kind of fits the same bill as someone like an Xavier Tillman, a Santi Aldama. He's a good player. He's a good player that has some versatility to him and has some skills that are very coveted, to be sure. On the flip side of that, you do kind of wonder about some of the front court clog that's involved in Memphis. Even just thinking past the guys who are playing right now, like a Zaire Williams or a David Roddy, Vince Williams Jr., who's recently started to blow up. There's a lot of other guys to kind of think about here in this like similar 4 or 5-ish spot. So that includes guys like Xavier Tillman, Santi Aldama, as I mentioned, both of them. You even have guys like Gigi Jackson, David Roddy, who kind of plays in a variety of spots, as I mentioned. Seriously though, like you do wonder kind of what the end game looks like here when you have all these guys who can kind of play these like 4 and 5 spots when you already have the money short up that you do in Brighton and Clarke. Does this front court kind of clog concern you at all? Do you still think that like Brandon Clarke is relatively safe for what it's worth?
It is a reason for concern. It's funny how of everyone on that list that you listed in that 4 or 5 spot, they're pretty much all tweeners, and none of them are true fives. If I had to choose someone to entrust to play the five in the modern NBA, it might actually be Brandon Clarke in terms of his repertoire and what he's shown in the past. Xavier Tillman has really fallen off a cliff since that red hot start to the year, and Brandon does seem like the most reliable option. But yeah, that Achilles is a big question mark. If he is fully healthy, I do like him the best out of that group for Memphis's purposes, especially as when they get Ja back and Smart and Bane, they'll be looking to contend. This is not a team that is blowing things up, even though it might look like it at the moment. But it's only because of their injuries, right? So if Clarke is healthy, I do believe that he will have a fair share of minutes on this team next year. But they definitely have to look into getting another five, because a true five like Steven Adams really unlocks a lot of what JJJ does, because he can help side. He's a great help side defender, and he gets a lot of blocks that way too. And he's not the greatest rebounder, so having a big sturdy five can alleviate a lot of that pressure. And I don't think Clarke is that guy. Clarke is unfortunately not 6'10", 7 foot. He's not even 6'8", I don't think, right? He's 6'7", 6'7.5". But my point is, he's not the traditional five that you really want to pair JJJ in the starting unit as. So I do see a role for him as maybe the first big off the bench if he's fully healthy. And that is a high-end outcome that is reasonable to try and acquire for very cheap at this point. I want to ask you, who do you think Memphis should target for a starting five alongside JJJ in this offseason, or even 2 days away from the trade deadline? Who should they be looking at?
So I'm glad you brought this up, and this is something I was just going to touch on from where we were going to go here. There is such a can of worms. I feel the situation opens now. Here's kind of my thought process, right? So what we're seeing right now is, if we're keeping score, so far Memphis has used 3 first-round picks in the last 3 drafts. So in their most recent 2 drafts where they had first-round picks, they used first-round picks on Zaire Williams, on Jake LaRavia, and on David Roddy. And, for what it's worth, there's been plenty of questions. I think easily what you see is the upside is in Zaire, even though what we still have seen is not great. I think David Roddy is fine as a piece. I think Jake LaRavia, we haven't seen a lot of Jake LaRavia, I think, is ultimately the thing. And you kind of wonder if maybe he's just a guy who hasn't quite figured out the feel for the NBA and is always just going to kind of be like an end of bench guy, maybe just someone who ends up just thriving in the G League. But, what's so interesting to me is now there's this need for a five. And I think when you consider their needs, this is really something that matters the most at this point. And there's a lot of different schools of thought you could have here. So this is a really strong draft for big men. What you're looking at with some of the upper half, and I've mentioned them earlier on the hour, it's guys who are like Alex Sarr, who are like Donovan Clingan. There's some really good targets for bigs that are in this little like upper half of the lottery where it kind of feels like they might end up being with their current situation. there's a lot of good big targets that they have, but then there's also this need for a three. I think they have so many of these guys who are kind of like the tweeners, as you alluded to, that they have that sort of situation figured out, but then they just have these holes at the 3 and at the 5 that you need to figure out. One of the good things about that, though, is they have this first round pick that is projecting to be pretty good, but then you just kind of wonder exactly where these pieces fall together. And so I guess, to make a long story short, I don't know exactly who maybe they should target. I wish I had a concrete answer. I honestly don't. I've tried to think about this a lot. I think there's a lot of different schools of thought you could go for at this point, and I think what I would say is, if they're going to be making any moves, I think the right move is probably, to try to make a move for a wing at the deadline. Find maybe an answer that you can at least solidify at the wing, and then you can kind of just figure out the 5 maybe through the draft. I think that might be a good way to go about it. I think definitely this offseason there might be some good targets that they can have, just sort of depending on what the market looks like. There's not a lot of great wings that are going to be available in this free agency class for what it's looking like right now. And so I think maybe the smart thing might be to just kind of hold off. But there's a lot of different schools of thought for sure, and they have some things to figure out. And I think, to kind of like bring it back a little bit, I think Brandon Clarke is a big help for them, and I think he's going to remain a key piece of this team, completely regardless of what they plan to do and some of their holes to address. But I think they have a lot of puzzle pieces that they just need to piece together. And I think that starts especially with addressing the situation at the 5. And I think moving on from Steven Adams says a lot about that, but I think it also makes you wonder even more exactly what the intention is going to be going forward. Brandon Clarke is a guy who's going to have a role as long as his health allows. And at this point, in terms of where he's at and what teams might be like holding on to him and looking at for him, I think this is exactly the kind of guy that you should buy and stash on IR. And there's a handful of guys that I think I can identify offhand that I really like as IR buys or stashes, however you really want to phrase that. I think Brandon Clarke at cost is maybe my favorite at the moment.